The sun broke over the eastern rim of the world with the slow, molten fury of a blacksmith's forge. It did not rise so much as it bled upward, a searing line of orange that pushed back the deep, star-pocked purple of the night. Down below, the land lay still and patient, a vast, cracked canvas of ochre and rust-colored dirt that stretched to an unseen horizon. This was the territory of Dust Creek Ranch, a sprawling kingdom of grit and silence carved out of the hide of West Texas by Jedediah Coulter. The name itself was a promise and a warning. There was a creek, but more often than not, it was just a winding scar of paler dust, a memory of water that the unforgiving sun had long since drunk dry. The air, even at this first blush of day, was heavy. It carried the scent of dry grass, of distant cattle, and of a heat that was already gathering its strength, preparing to press down on the land like a physical weight. The silence was immense, broken only by the low complaint of a timber beam in the main house settling, or the lonely, metallic cry of a windmill turning its face to a breeze that was not yet born. It was a silence that held stories, a quiet that was full of things left unsaid, of hardships endured and forgotten because there was no time to remember them. In the heart of this sprawling enterprise, separate from the main house and the long, low bunkhouse, stood the cookhouse. It was a sturdy, unadorned structure of clapboard and stone, its chimney already breathing a thin, gray plume of smoke into the brightening sky. This was Hester McCrae's domain. Here, the vast, intimidating silence of the prairie was tamed, replaced by the familiar, rhythmic sounds of work. Inside, Hester moved with an economy of motion that spoke of years spent in the same space, performing the same tasks. She was a woman built for endurance, not for speed. Broad in the shoulder and hip, with a soft roundness to her face and arms, she was a stark contrast to the lean, hardened men she fed. Her hair, the color of damp straw, was pinned in a tight, functional bun at the nape of her neck. Those stubborn wisps had already escaped to frame a face that was often placid, almost blank, as if she had learned to keep her thoughts tucked away in a place no one could see them. Her hands, though, told a different story. They were chapped and strong, nicked with small scars from errant knives and hot pans, but they were never still. They were always kneading, chopping, stirring, serving. The air in the kitchen was thick with the comforting smells of life. The bitter, robust aroma of coffee boiling in a giant tin pot on the cast-iron stove mingled with the salty, satisfying scent of thick-cut bacon sizzling in a pan. Beneath it all was the deep, savory promise of the beef and barley stew that was already simmering in a great cauldron, a meal that would be served not for breakfast, but for the noon dinner, its flavors deepening with every passing hour. The sounds were a symphony of routine, the steady thump, thump, thump of her knife dicing onions on a worn butcher's block, the metallic scrape of a large wooden spoon against the bottom of the stew pot, the hiss of fat as she laid another slab of bacon into the pan. A shaft of pale morning light cut through the single, grimy window over the wash basin, illuminating a universe of dancing dust motes. It fell across Hester's arm as she reached up to a high shelf for a canister of flour. Her sleeve, made of coarse, faded calico, was buttoned at the wrist, but the movement caused the fabric to pull taut and slide up her forearm by an inch. There, on the soft flesh just below her elbow, was the bruise. It was not a new mark. The angry, dark purple at its center had begun to bleed outward into a sickly halo of yellow and green, a dying sunset on her skin. It was an ugly, jarring splash of color against the pale canvas of her arm, a secret that had been momentarily betrayed by the light. She didn't flinch, her expression did not change, but her other hand moved with a swift, unconscious grace. A gesture so practiced it was like breathing, it flew to her arm, and with a single, smooth motion, she tugged the cuff of her sleeve back down, securing the button and hiding the mark from view. Her eyes remained fixed on the flour canister, her face a mask of serene focus. as if the motion had been nothing more than swatting away a fly. But her fingers, for just a fraction of a second, lingered on the fabric over the tender spot, a silent acknowledgement of the pain that lay hidden beneath. It was a reflex born of habit, of a long and weary acquaintance with keeping things covered. In the quiet solitude of her kitchen, she was an island, the undisputed ruler of her pots and pans. Here, she could create order, turn raw ingredients into sustenance, and impose a rhythm on the day that made sense. The world outside the cookhouse door was a different matter entirely. It was loud, unpredictable, and sharp-edged. It was a world of men, of sun, of dust, and of debts that were not always paid with coin. She carried the heavy canister back to the long wooden work table that dominated the center of the room. The fine white powder puffed into the air as she opened the lid, momentarily dusting her worn apron. She began to measure out the flour, her movements once again steady and methodical, pushing the brief exposure from her mind, burying it beneath the familiar weight of her morning chores. Biscuits, for 16 hungry men, wouldn't make themselves. The coffee needed to be poured, the bacon turned, the potatoes set to boil for the evening meal. The day was a long list of tasks, a chain that she forged link by link, from dawn until long after dusk. It was a life of repetition, a circle she walked every day, and in that predictability, there was a strange, fragile sort of safety. The bacon crackled in the pan. The stew bubbled softly on the stove. The sun climbed higher, turning the sky from orange to a pale, washed-out blue, and the heat began to press in earnest. For a long while, the only sounds were the ones Hester made, the familiar chorus of her work. The ranch was still sleeping, gathering its strength for the punishing day ahead. Then, a new sound intruded. It was faint at first, a low, rhythmic rumble that was more a feeling in the soles of her worn leather boots than something she could clearly hear. It was alien to the morning's quiet symphony. It wasn't the sound of the ranch hands stirring in the bunkhouse, nor the sound of Jed Calter's heavy tread crossing the yard from the main house. It was something else, something from outside. Hester paused, her hand hovering over the bowl of flour, her head tilted slightly. She listened, her placid expression finally showing a flicker of something else, a deep, ingrained watchfulness. The sound grew steadily, resolving itself out of the low hum of the morning. It was the unmistakable creak and groan of heavy wagon wheels turning on a dry axle, accompanied by the plodding, weary beat of a horse's hooves. The sound was coming from the main track that led to the ranch, but it was too early. The supply wagon from Fort Griffin wasn't due for another week. Visitors were rare, and they seldom arrived at sunrise. A cold knot tightened in her stomach. It was a feeling she knew well, a familiar dread that tasted like rust. The rhythm of her morning. The fragile peace she had constructed within the four walls of her kitchen had been broken. She didn't move to the window to look. She didn't have to. She knew the sound of that particular wagon, the one with the axle that had been threatening to give out for the better part of a year. She knew the gait of the tired old horse that pulled it. The sound was a harbinger, an omen rolling slowly but surely toward her, bringing with it the chaos of the world she tried so desperately to keep outside her door. The rumble grew louder, a promise of instability, a clear and certain sign that the carefully constructed silence of her life was about to be shattered. Hester closed her eyes for a single, long second, and when she opened them, her face was once again a calm, unreadable mask. She dipped the measuring cup into the flour and continued with her work. The sound of the wagon wheels had faded, not into silence, but into a thick, expectant quiet that was somehow worse. Hester found herself listening for a footstep, for a voice raised in anger, for the familiar prelude to chaos. But nothing came. The sun climbed, the bacon sizzled, and the only sounds were once again her own. A false calm settled over the kitchen, the kind that comes in the eye of a storm. She worked with a forced deliberation, her hands moving through their ingrained ballet of chopping and stirring while her ears remained strained, listening for the world beyond her door. When the doorway was suddenly filled, she didn't startle so much as her whole body went rigid. It wasn't the man she'd been expecting. It was Jedediah Coulter. He didn't knock. He never did. The cookhouse was part of his ranch, and by extension, part of him, but he didn't stride in either. He simply appeared, a figure of immense stillness who seemed to absorb the light and sound around him. He was a giant of a man, tall enough that he had to dip his head slightly to clear the lintel, with shoulders that were a solid slab of muscle, wide as an axe handle is long. The sun had burned him the color of cured leather, and his face was a landscape of harsh lines etched around his eyes and mouth, testament to a life lived squinting at the horizon. His hair was a thick, unruly thatch of sun-bleached brown, and his eyes, set deep beneath a heavy brow, were the color of a winter sky, a calm, steady gray that seemed to see everything and judge nothing. He radiated a profound and unshakable quiet, the kind of quiet that belongs to mountains and ancient trees. He was not a man of wasted words or wasted movements. He held his hat in one hand, a gesture of respect for the indoors that few of the other hands bothered with. He walked over to the counter where she kept a row of tin mugs, his boots making a soft, heavy sound on the wooden floorboards. The air seemed to grow thicker around him, charged with his sheer presence. Hester's own breath felt trapped in her lungs. She was accustomed to the boisterous, rowdy energy of the cowboys who would soon come stampeding in for breakfast. Jed's silence was a different entity altogether. It was heavier, more profound. "Mornin', Hester," he said. His voice was like his presence, low, deep, and without hurry. It was the sound of rocks grinding together deep in the earth. "Mr. Coulter," she replied, her own voice coming out thin and tight. She didn't turn to face him just yet, focusing instead on lifting the heavy bacon pan off the stove. She felt his eyes on her back, a calm, steady weight. It was a look she had grown used to over the months she'd worked for him. He was an observant man. He noticed when the flower stores were low, when a horse was favoring a leg, when the wind was shifting to bring rain. It was what made him a good rancher. But when that quiet, all-seeing gaze was turned on her, it made the skin on her neck prickle. She turned, holding the hot pan with a thick cloth, and moved to the sideboard to drain the bacon. It was an awkward angle, requiring her to reach across her body, her sleeve, the same one as before, rode up her arm once more. The bruise was there again, a blot of old violence in the warm, food-scented air of the kitchen. She knew the exact moment he saw it. She didn't see his eyes move, but she felt it. The steady weight of his gaze sharpened, just for a second, focusing on that one spot on her arm with a quiet intensity. A hot flush of shame and fear washed over her. Her hands fumbled, and a piece of bacon slid from the pan, landing with a soft hiss on the floor. "Clumsy," she muttered, bending quickly to retrieve it, using the motion as an excuse to hide her face and, more importantly, to pull her sleeve back down into its proper place. Men's eyes were dangerous. A look could be a question could be an accusation, and an accusation could be a justification. She had learned the hard way that a man's attention, of any kind, was a currency she could not afford to trade in. It always cost too much. When she straightened up, he was still standing there, his gray eyes looking at her face now. Not her arm, but something had changed. The quiet in his eyes was no longer just passive observation. There was a question in them now, a deep, unspoken inquiry that made her feel as though the walls of her kitchen were turning to glass. He said nothing. He didn't ask what happened. He didn't offer a word of sympathy. He simply looked at her, and in his gaze, she felt seen in a way that terrified her. It was a look that bypassed the hardened shell she presented to the world and saw the frightened, trembling thing she kept hidden inside. She turned away abruptly, her heart hammering against her ribs. "Coffee's hot," she said, her voice rough. She grabbed a mug, her hand shaking slightly, and filled it from the large pot. She set it on the counter with more force than necessary, the tin making a sharp clang against the wood. She refused to look at him, keeping her eyes fixed on a crack in the wall behind the stove. She wished he would just take his coffee and go, leave her to the safety of her routine. Jed picked up the mug, his large, calloused fingers wrapping around it. His hands were weathered and scarred. The hands of a man who worked his own land, who fixed his own fences and roped his own cattle. They looked powerful enough to snap a man's neck, yet he held the simple tin mug with a surprising gentleness. He took a sip of the hot coffee, his gaze sweeping over the kitchen, taking in the neat stacks of plates, the simmering pots, the general order she maintained. His eyes came to rest on the pantry door. He took another slow sip of coffee, then walked toward the small door at the back of the kitchen. As he pulled it open, it let out a long, grating shriek, the sound of metal protesting against metal. It was a noise Hester had lived with for months, a small, daily irritation. The top hinge was rusted through and barely holding. Jed let the door swing shut, and it shrieked again in protest. He stood there for a moment, his brow furrowed slightly as he stared at the offending hinge. Hester watched him, her suspicion warring with a reluctant curiosity. What was he doing? Without a word, he set his coffee mug on the work table and turned, walking out of the cookhouse with the same unhurried pace he had entered. Hester was left in a state of confused silence. She heard his heavy boots cross the dusty yard, the soft jingle of his spurs. Was he leaving? A part of her sagged with relief, but then she heard him returning. He came back inside carrying a small, worn leather roll. He unlaced it on the table, revealing a modest collection of tools, a wrench, a few files, a small hammer, and a tin of axle grease. He went back to the pantry door, his large frame dwarfing it, and began to work. Hester stood by the stove, a wooden spoon clutched in her hand, and watched. She didn't know what else to do. It felt strange, having him there, not as the boss giving orders, but as a man simply fixing something that was broken. His movements were slow, deliberate, and surprisingly precise. He used a small file to scrape away the rust, his huge, powerful hands guiding the tiny instrument with an artist's care. He worked the pins out of the hinge, his knuckles brushing against the door frame. He didn't grunt with effort or curse when a screw was stubborn. He simply applied steady, patient pressure until the metal yielded. The silence stretched, broken only by the soft, rhythmic scrape of the file and the gentle bubble of the stew. It was a different kind of silence now. The tension that had crackled in the air when he had looked at her arm had dissipated, replaced by a quiet focus on the task at hand. She found herself studying him, this quiet giant of a man. She saw the way the muscles in his forearm bunched as he tightened a bolt, the deep concentration in the set of his jaw. There was a profound lack of ego in his actions. The door was broken, so he was fixing it. The logic was as simple and solid as he was. "You don't have to do that, Mr. Coulter," she finally managed to say, the words feeling clumsy in the quiet space. "I could have asked one of the hands." He didn't look up from his work. "It's no trouble," he rumbled, his voice low. He applied a small amount of grease to the hinge pins with his finger. A squeak like that can wear a person down. His words struck her. He wasn't just fixing a piece of metal. He had recognized the sound as an irritation, as something that would fray the edges of a person's peace. He had noticed a small detail of her comfort. It was a thought so foreign that she didn't know how to process it. He slotted the pins back into place, tapped them gently with the hammer, and then swung the door open. It moved without a sound, gliding on its hinges as if it were brand new, a smooth, satisfying silence where there had once been a piercing shriek. He opened and closed it a few more times, his expression betraying a quiet satisfaction. He nodded once, then began to pack his tools back into the leather roll, his movements just as neat and methodical as before. Hester watched the door, a small, foolish smile threatening to touch her lips. The absence of the squeal was like a weight lifted. Jed picked up his now lukewarm coffee and drained the mug in 2 long swallows. He placed it by the wash basin, ready to be cleaned. He turned to go, pausing for a moment in the doorway. He looked at her, his gray eyes holding hers for a beat longer than was comfortable. "A person deserves some quiet in their own space. Hester," he said, his voice soft but clear. And then he was gone. Hester stood frozen in the middle of the kitchen, his words hanging in the air like the scent of wood smoke. She walked over to the pantry door and pushed it open. It swung inward with a whisper of moving air. She closed it, a soft, solid click. No shriek, no protest, just peace. The silence he left behind was not the tense, watchful quiet from before. It was a deep, calm silence, a silence that felt clean. It was the silence of a problem solved, of a small bit of chaos put back in its place. For the first time in a very long time, Hester stood in the presence of a silence that did not feel like a threat. It did not feel like the breath held before a storm. It felt steady. It felt safe. The feeling was so new, so utterly alien, that it brought a lump to her throat. He had seen her bruise, and he hadn't said a word, but he had heard the squeaking hinge, and he had silenced it. It was a message, delivered without words, a small act of kindness in a world that had shown her very little. He hadn't fixed her problem, not the real one, but he had fixed a problem, and in doing so, had told her that she was not entirely invisible after all. The quiet that Jed Coulter had left in his wake lingered in the cookhouse for days. It was a tangible thing, a pocket of peace in Hester's world. Every time she swung the pantry door open and was met not with a jarring shriek, but with a soft, unobtrusive whisper. A strange and unfamiliar warmth would curl in her stomach. It was a feeling so foreign she was afraid to give it a name. Hope was a dangerous commodity, a currency she had traded in long ago for the leaden coin of endurance. Endurance was reliable. It asked nothing of you but that you continue to draw breath. Hope, on the other hand, was a wild, untamable thing that could bolt at the first sign of trouble, leaving you more broken than before. Once a week, one of the younger ranch hands, a boy named Billy, would drive the buckboard into Harmony Creek for supplies. It was a trip Hester both needed and dreaded. The town was a collection of a dozen or so sun-bleached buildings huddled together against the vast emptiness of the prairie, a place where whispers traveled faster than a horse could gallop. The heart of the town was Thompson's Mercantile, a long, dim building that smelled of coffee beans, cured leather, and dust. It was here that news was traded. Reputations were made and broken, and the lonely lives of homesteaders and ranchers were picked apart like stitches from an old quilt. On this particular trip, the air in the Mercantile felt thick, charged with a current of unspoken words. Mrs. Thompson, a woman whose face was a permanent mask of sour disapproval, gave Hester a look that was sharper than usual. Hester ignored it, her own expression carefully blank, and focused on her list. Flour, salt, beans, a new spool of thread. She moved through the store with her usual quiet efficiency, her presence as unassuming as a shadow. It was by the pickle barrel that she heard it. Two women, wives of local farmers, were speaking in low, conspiratorial tones, their voices carrying in the still air. They did not see Hester, who stood half-hidden behind a tall stack of feed sacks. "I lost every last dollar. I heard one of them," Martha said, her voice dripping with a kind of grim satisfaction. "Played cards with Silas Blackwood over in Redemption. A fool's game. Everyone knows Blackwood doesn't play for anything less than a man's soul." "It's a shame, is what it is," the other woman, Eleanor, clucked, leaving his wife to fend for herself like that. "She's a hard worker, that one. Cooks for all those men out at the Coulter place. Must be 20 of them. And him gallivanting across the territory, throwing away money he doesn't have." Hester's hand, which had been reaching for a jar of preserves, froze in midair. Her blood turned to ice in her veins. Dawson. They were talking about Dawson Pike, her husband. The name hung in the air between the women. An unlit firecracker. She stood perfectly still, her back to them, praying they wouldn't turn and see her. She forced her hand to complete its task, her fingers closing around the cool glass of the jar. She placed it in her basket with a steady, deliberate motion, as if she were deaf to their words. But inside, a storm was raging. Every syllable was a lash, stripping away the fragile peace she had so carefully constructed. "He owes Blackwood a fortune, they say," Martha continued, leaning closer to Eleanor. "And Silas Blackwood is not a man who forgives a debt. I wouldn't want to be in Dawson Pike's boots when he comes to collect, or his wife's, for that matter." Hester's hand went to the stew pot on the stove, a phantom limb seeking its familiar comfort. She could almost feel the worn, smooth handle of the wooden spoon, the thick, slow resistance of the simmering beef and vegetables. Stirring, always stirring. Keep the hands busy, keep the face blank, keep the world from seeing the terror that was clawing at the inside of your ribs. The women's voices faded as they moved away, but their words remained, echoing in the cavern of her mind. And with them, the memories came, unbidden and sharp as broken glass. She saw herself as a girl of 19 in Ohio, her world small and gray and circumscribed by the rigid expectations of her family. Then Dawson Pike had arrived, a traveling salesman with a smile as bright and promising as a newly minted gold coin. He spoke of the West not as a place, but as a dream, a land of endless sky and limitless opportunity, where a man with grit could build an empire and a woman could be the queen of it. He had painted pictures with his words, of a whitewashed house with a green door, of fields of golden wheat, of a life so full of freedom and sunshine it made her gray Ohio world seem like a tomb. And she, naive and hungry for a life larger than the one she knew, had believed him. She had packed her small trunk, turned her back on the only home she had ever known, and followed him west, her heart thrumming with a dangerous, intoxicating hope. The journey itself had been the first crack in the dream, the endless, bone-jarring rattle of the wagon, the choking dust, the gnawing fear of the unknown, the promised land. When they finally arrived, was not a verdant paradise but a harsh, unforgiving expanse of rock and scrub. Dawson's bright smile began to tarnish at the edges. The hard work of building a life from scratch, of plowing stubborn earth that refused to yield, was not the grand adventure he had imagined. His ambition, once a blazing fire, soured into a resentful, smoky ember. He started spending more time in town than on their small, failing homestead. He was searching for an easier path, a shortcut to the fortune he felt the world owed him. He found it in the dim, smoky confines of the saloon, in the slick shuffle of a deck of cards. At first, he came home elated, his pockets jingling with winnings, his eyes alight with the old, charming fire. He would sweep her into his arms, promising her silks and pearls, promising the dream was still alive. But the wins grew less frequent, the losses more catastrophic. The charming fire in his eyes was replaced by a feverish, desperate gleam. The man who had spoken of building an empire now spoke only of the turn of a card, of the one big pot that would change everything. His laughter became harsh, his touch impatient. The dream of the whitewashed house dissolved into the grim reality of a one-room sod hut and a mountain of debt. The first time he'd laid a hand on her, it had been a shock that stole her breath. A disagreement over a few dollars he wanted for another game. His voice had risen, sharp and ugly, and when she had stood her ground, his hand had flown out, catching her across the cheek. The sting was nothing compared to the shattering of the last, fragile pane of glass that was her love for him. In his eyes, she had seen not anger, but a stranger's cold contempt. After that, it became easier for him. The disappointments of his life, the failures of his own making, were all somehow her fault. She became the place he dumped his rage, the soft target for his bitter frustrations. The bruises became a secret language on her skin, a testament to a dream that had died a violent, ugly death. A sudden noise pulled her from the depths of her memory. It was the heavy thud of a sack of grain being dropped onto the floorboards nearby. Jed Kelter stood there, his back to her, speaking in his low, quiet voice to Mr. Thompson. He had not been there when she arrived. His presence filled the store. A silent, solid mountain of a man. Had he heard the women? Did he know the rumors that were now attached to her name like burrs to a blanket? She watched as a younger rancher, a man named Silas, approached Jed, his face eager with the fresh gossip. "Mr. Calter," Silas began, his voice a little too loud. "Did you hear about Dawson Pike? They say he owes Blackwood near $500. Hester's heart stopped. She held her breath, waiting. Jed turned his head slowly and fixed Silas with his calm, gray gaze. He didn't speak for a long moment. The noisy, gossip-hungry energy seemed to drain out of the younger man under that steady, unreadable look. "Some debts," Jed said, his voice quiet but carrying the weight of finality, "are paid in silence." He turned his attention back to Mr. Thompson, leaving Silas standing there, looking confused and chastened. The statement was a wall. It was not an invitation to discuss the matter further. It was the closing of a door. Hester let out a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. He knew. Of course he knew. He knew her husband's name, and he knew the trouble he was in, but he had not participated in the gossip. He had not looked at her with pity or speculation. He had, in his own quiet way, silenced it. She finished her shopping in a daze, paid Mrs. Thompson, and fled the store, her basket feeling impossibly heavy. The ride back to the ranch was a blur, the vast landscape, usually a source of grim comfort, felt menacing, full of hiding places. Dawson was out there somewhere, a cornered animal, and cornered animals were the most dangerous. The fear was a familiar companion, a cold hand gripping her heart. But as the buckboard rattled on, another feeling began to surface, pushing up through the layers of fear like a stubborn spring shoot. It was the memory of Jed's words, of his gaze. The women in the store, the men in the town, they all looked at her and saw Dawson Pike's wife. They saw a problem, a shame, a piece of someone else's property. Their gazes either slid right over her or stuck to her with a thick, unwelcome pity. Jed Calter had looked at her, and he had seen a woman with a bruise on her arm. He had seen a woman who flinched at the sound of a squeaking door. He hadn't looked away. He hadn't offered empty words. He had seen the small, broken things in her world and had, in his own silent, solid way, offered a moment of repair. He saw her. The realization was a terrifying, exhilarating shock, like diving into icy water. For so many years, she had survived by making herself invisible, by becoming a ghost in her own life. To be seen, truly seen, felt like standing naked in a high wind. It was frightening. It was dangerous. But as she looked out at the endless horizon, for the first time in a very long time, it also felt a little like being found. The fear was still there, cold and sharp, but now it had a companion, a tiny, fragile spark of something she still didn't dare to name. The uneasy peace of the past week had been a fragile skin stretched over a deep well of anxiety. Every unfamiliar sound, every rider approaching from a distance, had caused Hester's heart to leap into her throat. She had told herself it was foolish, that Dawson could be gone for months at a time, but the rumors from town had planted a seed of dread that had taken root and grown into a thorny vine around her thoughts. The day ended as it always did, in a blaze of dramatic, lonely color. The sun, a swollen orb of liquid fire, sank below the horizon, dragging the light with it. The vast Texas sky was painted in violent streaks of orange, pink, and a deep, bruised purple. Long, skeletal shadows stretched from the bunkhouse and the windmill, turning the familiar ranch yard into a place of looming, unfamiliar shapes. The air grew cool, carrying the scent of dust, tired horses, and the rich, savory smell of the pot roast that Hester was tending for the evening meal. The ranch hands were drifting in from the range, their weary banter and the jingle of their spurs a familiar end-of-day chorus. Hester was in her element, moving with practiced grace in the warm, lamplit bubble of the cookhouse. This was the busiest time of her day, a controlled whirlwind of activity that left no room for stray thoughts. The roast was simmering, the biscuits were browning in the oven, and the gravy was thickening on the stove. She moved between her stations, a commander in her own small, fragrant territory. Then came the sound. It was the one she'd been subconsciously listening for, the one her body recognized before her mind had a chance to process it. The agonized, dry groan of a familiar wagon axle. It was not a distant premonition this time. It was here, close. It sliced through the evening air, a sound so discordant it made the hair on her arms stand on end. She froze, a ladle full of gravy held trembling in her hand. A few dark drops spattered onto the clean wooden floor. Through the open doorway, she could see it, the dilapidated wagon, pulled by the sway-backed, bone-weary horse, was lumbering into the main yard, and at the reins, slumped but still radiating a wiry, coiled tension, was Dawson Pike. He looked like a man who had been chewed up and spit out by the world. His hat was pushed back on his head, revealing a greasy tangle of dark hair. A multi-day growth of beard shadowed a jawline that was clenched with resentment. His clothes were rumpled and stained, and even from this distance, she could see the wild, bloodshot glare in his eyes. He pulled the horse to a rough, jarring halt in the middle of the yard, the wagon groaning in protest. He was a monument to failure, stinking of cheap whiskey and shattered pride. Hester's first instinct was primal. She recoiled, stepping back from the doorway, letting the shadows at the rear of the cookhouse swallow her. She pressed herself against the rough-hewn wall, her breath coming in shallow, silent gasps. She felt like a mouse that had just heard the shadow of a hawk's wings pass overhead. Be still. Be silent. Disappear. Her heart hammered a frantic, painful rhythm against her ribs. From her sliver of a vantage point, she could see the yard. A few of the ranch hands, who had been laughing and washing up at the pump, fell silent. They cast wary glances at the newcomer, then at the main house. Dawson swung himself down from the wagon, his movements unsteady but aggressive. He stumbled, caught himself, and shot a belligerent glare at the silent cowboys, as if daring them to comment. Then Hester saw Jed. The rancher had been over by the corral, speaking with his foreman, a grizzled old hand named Hank. When the wagon had arrived, Jed had simply stopped talking. Now, he turned his body slowly, deliberately, to face the center of the yard. He didn't move forward. He didn't call out. He just stood there, his feet planted firmly in the dust, his arms loose at his sides. He straightened to his full, towering height, a silent, immovable object that suddenly dominated the entire landscape. The dying light of the sunset caught the hard planes of his face, making him look as if he were carved from the very rock of the land itself. The confrontation was utterly silent, a battle waged with nothing more than posture and presence. On one side was Dawson Pike, a whirlwind of chaotic, drunken energy. He swayed on his feet, his hands clenching and unclenching, his eyes darting around, looking for a challenge, for an outlet for the bitter rage that consumed him. He was a man unraveling at the seams, held together only by fury and alcohol. On the other side was Jed Coulter. He was a pillar of absolute control. His stillness was profound, a deep, quiet strength that seemed to draw all the nervous energy out of the air and absorb it. His gray eyes, steady and unblinking, were fixed on Dawson. It was not a threatening look. Not exactly. It was a look of pure, unadulterated observation. It was the look a man gives a coiled rattlesnake he's just found on the path. He was weighing, measuring, and waiting. Dawson felt the weight of that gaze. He had to. He puffed out his chest, trying to project a defiance he clearly didn't feel. He hitched up his trousers and spat a brown stream of tobacco juice into the dust, a gesture of crude contempt that fell flat in the face of Jed's monumental stillness. The entire ranch seemed to be holding its breath. The lowing of cattle, the nicker of horses, the murmur of the ranch hands, it all faded into a tense, humming silence, leaving the two men standing in the middle of the yard as if they were the only two people left in the world. Dawson broke first. He couldn't stand the silent judgment, the sheer, immovable presence of the rancher. With a muttered curse, he tore his gaze away from Jed and began to storm, not towards the cookhouse, but towards the small, isolated cabin at the edge of the property that he and Hester were supposed to call home. Every step was a blow against the earth, the walk of a man spoiling for a fight he knew he couldn't win. As he disappeared into the darkness, the spell was broken. The ranch hands began to move again, but their movements were subdued, their voices low. The sun had finally vanished, plunging the yard into a deep, velvety twilight. Lamps were lit in the bunkhouse and the main house, creating small, lonely islands of yellow in a sea of encroaching black. Night fell, and it brought with it the chill of fear and the distinct, sour smell of whiskey that seemed to hang in the air around Dawson's wagon. Hester remained pressed against the wall in the dark of her kitchen, trembling so violently she had to bite her lip to keep her teeth from chattering. He was back. The monster she had fled was sleeping just 100 yards from her door. The fragile bubble of her safety had been burst. But the men needed to eat. The roast was ready. The biscuits were done. The routine, the one solid thing in her life, called to her. To abandon it now would be to surrender completely, with a monumental effort of will. She pushed herself away from the wall. Her legs felt like jelly, her hands like clumsy blocks of ice. She forced herself back into the lamplight, back to her stove. She began to dish out the food onto the heavy ceramic plates, her movements jerky and unnatural. She could hear sounds from the cabin now, a door slamming with enough force to shake the ground, the sound of a bottle being slammed down on a wooden table, a low, angry muttering that she couldn't make out but whose venomous tone she knew all too well. Every sound was a physical blow, making her flinch. The ranch hands began to file in, their usual boisterousness replaced by a somber quiet. They knew. Of course, they knew. They took their plates with mumbled words of thanks, their eyes avoiding hers. They saw the terror she was trying so desperately to hide. They saw her trembling hands, the stark pallor of her face under the warm lamplight. She worked on, an automaton fueled by sheer terror and the ingrained habit of her duty. Stir the gravy, slice the bread, pour the coffee. Don't think about the man in the cabin. Don't think about the coming night. Don't think about the look in his eyes. Don't think. Just work. The rhythmic, mundane tasks were a prayer, a desperate plea to keep the darkness at bay. But the fear was a living thing inside her, a cold, writhing serpent in her belly. The night was young, and it stretched before her, an eternity of darkness filled with the certainty of his rage. She was trapped, cooking a meal in a cage while the predator paced just outside. The last of the ranch hands had shuffled off to the bunkhouse, their low voices and the scuff of their boots fading into the night. A profound quiet descended upon Dust Creek Ranch, a silence that was not peaceful but heavy, like the air before a lightning strike. Inside the cookhouse, Hester moved through the familiar motions of cleaning up, but her body was a tightly coiled spring of pure dread. The lamplight cast long, dancing shadows that seemed to writhe in the corners of the room. Every gust of wind that rattled the window pane, every distant coyote howl, was the sound of approaching footsteps. She worked with her back to the door, a foolish, superstitious defense, as if not seeing the monster would prevent it from appearing. The door didn't open. It exploded inward, slamming against the interior wall with a crack of splintering wood that was as sharp and final as a gunshot. Dawson Pike filled the doorway, a dark, swaying silhouette against the star-dusted night. He took a staggering step inside, and the small, warm room was instantly contaminated by his presence. The air, which moments before had smelled of soap and leftover bread, was now thick with the sour, cloying stench of cheap whiskey. He held a half-empty bottle in one hand, gripping its neck like a weapon.
"There she is,"
he slurred, his voice a venomous rasp. "Hard at work, always the busy little bee." Hester didn't turn around. She stood frozen at the wash basin, her hands submerged in the soapy water, her knuckles white where she gripped a heavy ceramic plate. She could feel his eyes on her back, hot and hateful. "What's the matter? Not gonna greet your husband," he sneered, taking another unsteady step into the room. The floorboards groaned under his weight. "Or are you too busy thinking about your boss?" He spat the word bosses as if it were a curse. Hester remained silent, her gaze fixed on her own distorted reflection in the dark window above the sink. She could see him behind her, a wavering, monstrous shape in the glass. "Don't you ignore me. Hester!" His voice was rising, fraying at the edges with a familiar, dangerous instability. "I saw it. Don't think I didn't. I saw the way he looks at you. That big, silent bastard. Staring at you like you're some prize heifer he's thinking of buying." He was closer now. She could feel the heat radiating from his body. She began to wash the plate, her movements stiff and mechanical. The scrape of the cloth against the ceramic was the only sound in the room. A small, domestic noise in a universe that had suddenly shrunk to this single, terrifying point of conflict. "And you," he hissed, his voice right behind her ear now. She flinched, a violent shudder running through her. "You look at him too, standing there all meek and mild, with your eyes cast down. But you're looking. Think I don't know that look? The look of a woman who's forgotten her place." He grabbed her shoulder, his fingers digging in like talons, and spun her around. The plate slipped from her grasp, falling into the basin with a dull, heavy thud. Soapy water sloshed onto the floor. She found herself face to face with him, with his bloodshot eyes and the cruel twist of his lips. "You think you're better than me," he snarled, his face inches from hers. His breath was a foul wave of alcohol and self-pity. "Hiding out here, cooking for him and his men. You think I'm a fool? You think I don't know what goes on when I'm gone?" He was working himself into a frenzy, his accusations feeding on their own poison. He wasn't seeing her anymore. He was seeing a specter of his own failure, a personification of the respect Jed Kelter commanded and he, Dawson, had lost. He shoved her backward, and she stumbled, catching herself on the edge of the long work table. Her hip struck the hard wood with a painful jolt. He followed her, his rage a physical force that pushed her back. Everything was fine until we came to this God-forsaken place. To his land, Dawson swept his arm across the table, sending a neat stack of tin cups flying. They hit the floor with a series of hollow, clattering bangs that echoed in the strained silence. He's got everything: land, cattle, respect. And now he thinks he can have my wife, too. This was the core of it. His wounded pride. The silent, powerful judgment he had felt from Jed in the yard had festered in his liquor-soaked mind, curdling into a paranoid, jealous rage. Hester was simply the nearest object on which to vent it. He lunged for her, grabbing the front of her dress and pulling her close. "Tell me," he roared, shaking her. "You've been with him." Hester stared into his eyes, and for the first time she felt something other than just fear. A cold, hard anger was beginning to form in the pit of her stomach. It was the anger of a creature that had been cornered one too many times. She saw him not as the charming man she had once loved, or even the monster she feared, but as something small and pathetic, a man drowning in his own weakness. She didn't answer. Her silence seemed to infuriate him more than any denial would have. With a wordless cry of rage, he released her and turned on the kitchen itself. He was a storm of destruction. He kicked a chair, sending it scraping and tumbling across the floor. He swept a hanging pot rack with his arm, and heavy iron skillets crashed to the ground with a deafening, discordant clang. A canister of flour was knocked from a shelf, and it burst upon impact, throwing a fine, ghostly cloud into the air. The white powder hung in the lamplight, turning the scene into a hellish, slow-motion nightmare. He was breathing in harsh, ragged gasps now, his chest heaving. He spun back to face her, his eyes wild, He saw her standing there, still silent. Her chin held a fraction higher than before. He saw defiance, and he couldn't bear it. He stalked towards her, backing her against the wall, near the shelves where she kept the plates. He raised a hand, and she flinched, bracing for the blow. And in that moment, as she waited for the familiar sting of pain, something broke inside her. Not her spirit, her silence, the years of quiet endurance, of swallowed words and stifled cries, fell away. He was a storm, yes, but she was the bedrock he was breaking himself against. He was chaos, but she was the quiet, steady beat of a heart that refused to stop. He grabbed her arm, his grip bruisingly tight. "You are mine," he snarled, his face a mask of fury. "You belong to me." The words came out of her, not as a shout, but as a low, clear, and unshakable truth. A sound that cut through his drunken rage like a shard of clean glass. "I'm not yours to break." The sound of her own voice surprised her. It was steady. It was calm. It was the voice of a woman she didn't know she was. The word struck Dawson with the force of a physical blow. He froze, his hand still on her arm, his mouth half open. He had been expecting tears. Please, submission. He had not been expecting this quiet, absolute strength. Her defiance was a mirror, and in it, for a split second, he saw the pathetic, ugly truth of what he had become, the foundation of his rage, which was built entirely on her fear, crumbled into dust. Confusion warred with fury in his eyes. He let go of her arm as if it had burned him. He shoved her, a last, desperate act of dominance. It wasn't a calculated blow, just a clumsy, frustrated push. Hester stumbled sideways, her arm flailing out to catch her balance. Her hand and forearm scraped down the wall, right through the pile of shattered ceramic from a plate he'd knocked down earlier. A sharp, searing pain shot up her arm. Dawson stared at her, then at the chaos surrounding them. The overturned chair, the scattered pots, the ghost-white film of flour that covered everything. The fight went out of him, replaced by a sullen, hollow emptiness. He looked at her one last time, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes, shame, perhaps, or just utter defeat. Without another word, he turned, grabbed his whiskey bottle from the floor, and staggered out into the night, leaving the broken door swinging gently in his wake. Hester was left standing in the wreckage of her sanctuary. The silence that descended was absolute, broken only by her own ragged breathing. Adrenaline coursed through her, making her tremble. She looked around at the mess, at the violation of her one safe space. Then she looked down at her arm. A deep, clean slice ran across her forearm, welling with dark, crimson blood. It dripped from her fingertips onto the flour-dusted floor, each drop a bright, shocking star of red against the white. The pain, sharp and clean, anchored her to the present moment. A shadow fell across the open doorway, blocking the stars. Jedediah Coulter stood there. He wasn't breathing hard. He hadn't run, but he was simply there. His eyes, grim and cold as a winter storm, took in the entire scene in one sweeping, comprehensive glance. He saw the shattered plates, the flour, the overturned chair. Then his eyes settled on Hester, on her pale, shocked face, and finally, on the bright, steady drip of blood from her arm. His face was carved from stone, but a fire blazed in the depths of his gray eyes. It was a cold, controlled rage that was 1,000 times more terrifying than Dawson's chaotic fury. He didn't speak. What was there to say? Words were useless trinkets in a moment like this. He walked into the room, his heavy boots making no sound on the flour-softened floor. He moved past her as if she were a ghost and went directly to the water pump. He took a clean linen dish towel from a hook. His movements were economical, precise. He pumped a stream of cold, clear water onto the cloth, wringing it out with a single, powerful twist of his hands. He turned and walked back to her. She watched him approach, her fear of Dawson being replaced by a different, more complex emotion. As he drew near, she flinched involuntarily, a deeply ingrained response to a large man moving toward her with purpose. He saw the flinch. He stopped instantly, a few feet away from her. He stood perfectly still, waiting, letting her see that he was not a threat. He held the damp cloth out slightly, a silent offering. After a long moment, when her trembling had subsided, he took a slow step forward. He gently took hold of her injured arm. His touch was so light, so impossibly tender for a man with such large, calloused hands, that it almost made her weep. He said nothing. He simply held her arm, his thumb stroking the back of her hand in a small, reassuring gesture. With his other hand, he began to clean the wound, his movements deft and careful, wiping away the blood and the grime with a focused intensity. The world narrowed to this single, silent act. There was no wrecked kitchen, no drunken husband, no fear. There was only the solid, warm presence of this man and the gentle, meticulous care of his hands on her skin. He finished cleaning the cut, and then, using the same cloth, he folded it into a thick, neat pad and wrapped it firmly around her forearm. Fashioning a secure bandage, he tied the ends with a practiced knot. He let go of her arm. His work was done. He looked at her, his gray eyes holding hers. In them, she saw not pity, but a resolute, unshakable promise. He still hadn't said a single word, but the message was as clear as if he had shouted it from the rooftops. This ends now. The silence in the kitchen was a living thing. It was composed of the aftermath of violence, the faint, metallic scent of blood, the ghostly white of the flour that coated every surface, the jagged shadows cast by overturned furniture. Hester stood in the center of it all, her newly bandaged arm a throbbing, physical testament to the night's chaos. The world had shrunk to the tight, clean pressure of the cloth against her skin and the immense, quiet presence of the man standing before her. Jed Coulter finally broke the silence. His voice, when it came, was not loud, but it filled the ruined space, a low, solid sound that seemed to push back the darkness. "You stay here tonight," he said. He was not looking at the mess on the floor. He was looking directly at her, his gray eyes holding hers. It was not a question or a suggestion. It was a statement of fact, a realignment of the world. He tilted his head slightly toward the main house, looming dark and solid in the night. In the house, you're safe. The words were simple, but they struck Hester with the force of a revelation. The concept of safety was so alien, so long forgotten, that she could barely comprehend it. Her mind, conditioned by years of abuse, immediately leaped to the consequences. "I can't," she whispered, the words catching in her throat. Her gaze darted nervously towards the broken door, towards the darkness where Dawson had disappeared. "He'll come back. If I'm not in the cabin, he'll be angry. He'll tear the place apart looking for me." It was the logic of the caged, the terror of defying the captor. Her world was a small, brutal kingdom, and Dawson was its king. To leave her designated place was an act of treason she could not imagine surviving. Jed's expression didn't change. He did not argue or try to convince her. He simply stood there, a mountain of quiet resolve, and delivered his promise with two words that were as solid and final as granite. He won't. There was such absolute, unshakable certainty in his voice that it momentarily silenced the frantic, terrified monologue in Hester's mind. It was not a boast. It was not a threat. It was a fact. It was the same certainty with which he might have said the sun will rise, or the rain will fall. He knew Dawson would not be coming back tonight, and his knowing was so powerful that it became a truth she could almost believe. He made a small, quiet gesture with his hand, an invitation to follow. Hester hesitated for only a second, her feet feeling rooted to the floor of her violated sanctuary. But then she looked at the shattered plate on the floor, at the dark drops of her own blood on the white flour, and she looked back at Jed's steady, waiting form. She took a single, shaky step, and then another, away from the wreckage and toward him. He didn't touch her, but he walked close beside her as they crossed the dark yard. The night air was cool and clean, a stark contrast to the thick, whiskey-sour atmosphere of the cookhouse. It smelled of damp earth and sagebrush. Above them, a billion stars were scattered across the black velvet sky. Cold and impossibly distant, the universe felt vast and indifferent. But the presence of the man beside her was a warm, solid anchor in the terrifying emptiness. The main house was dark and silent. Everyone was asleep. Jed led her not through the front door, but through a side entrance that opened into a quiet hallway. He moved through the darkness of his own home with a familiar, easy grace. He opened a door, struck a match that flared to life, and lit a small oil lamp on a bedside table. The room was bathed in a soft, gentle glow. It was a small, simple guest room, impeccably clean and Spartan. There was a sturdy wooden bed with a thick quilt folded neatly at its foot, a washstand with a pitcher and bowl, and a single wooden chair. The air smelled of cedar, old books, and clean linen. There was nothing of Dawson in this room. No lingering scent of stale liquor, no oppressive aura of anger. It was a space of profound and simple peace. "Get some rest, Hester," Jed said quietly from the doorway. She turned to thank him, but he was already gone, pulling the door quietly closed behind him, leaving her alone in the safest place she had been in a decade. Sleep, of course, was impossible. She sat on the edge of the bed, her hands folded in her lap, her bandaged arm a constant, dull ache. For hours, she just sat and listened. She listened to the quiet sounds of the house settling, the distant hoot of an owl, the gentle sigh of the wind as it moved through the eaves. She was listening for a footstep, for a drunken shout, for the splintering of another door, but the sounds never came. The silence held, deep and unbroken. The sheer absence of fear was a physical sensation. It was so profound, so unfamiliar, that it made her feel lightheaded. For years, her body had been a fortress under constant siege, every muscle tensed, every nerve on high alert. Here, in this quiet room, the siege was over. Slowly, cautiously, the drawbridge to her heart began to lower. She replayed the events of the night in her mind, not with the frantic terror of before, but with a strange, new sense of detachment. She saw Dawson's face, contorted with a rage that was born of weakness. She saw the kitchen, her space, torn apart, and she heard her own voice, clear and steady, speaking a truth she hadn't known she possessed. "I'm not yours to break." The words had been a revelation. They had not been a plea or an argument. They had been a statement of a fundamental shift within her. He could hurt her body. He could destroy her possessions. But the core of her, the essential part that was Hester, was not his to shatter. It was her own. She was reclaiming it. And then there was Jed. His silence was more eloquent than any speech. He hadn't offered pity. Pity was a useless, condescending emotion that made the receiver feel smaller. Instead, he had offered something real. He had offered competence. He had offered protection. He had cleaned and bandaged her wound with a gentleness that belied his immense strength. He had moved her from a place of danger to a place of safety. He hadn't asked. He had simply acted, his actions a clear and unambiguous language. He had seen that she was broken, and his immediate, instinctual response had been to mend. Sometime in the deep, dark hours before dawn, she finally lay down, not on top of the quilt, but under it, pulling its heavy, comforting weight over her. She closed her eyes, and for the first time in a night that felt a lifetime long, she breathed a full, deep breath that did not catch on a knot of fear. She woke with a start, not from a nightmare, but from the deep, dreamless sleep of pure exhaustion. The room was still dark, but a subtle change in the quality of the light told her that dawn was approaching. A thick ground fog had rolled in overnight, pressing against the window pane like a soft, gray blanket. Drawn by an instinct she didn't understand, She slipped out of the bed and went to the window, peering out into the ethereal, misty world. The ranch was silent, asleep, shrouded in a ghostly white veil. The shapes of the barn and the corral were soft, blurred outlines. The air was perfectly still, and the world seemed to be holding its breath, waiting for the sun. Then, a figure emerged from the deeper shadows of the barn. It was Jed. He was leading his horse, a powerful dark shape that moved with a silent grace at his side. He was dressed for the trail, not for ranch work. He moved with a quiet, relentless purpose, every action economical and precise. He checked the saddle, adjusted the bridle, and then swung himself up onto the horse's back in one smooth, fluid motion. He sat for a moment, a tall, solitary figure surveying the sleeping, mist-shrouded ranch. He was a king in his own quiet kingdom. He did not look towards the house. He did not know he had an audience. He was simply a man setting out to do a thing that needed to be done. He turned the horse's head, and without a backward glance, he urged it forward into the fog. He did not gallop. He moved at a steady, determined walk, a pace that could eat up miles without tiring the horse. He rode straight out, away from the ranch, and the mist began to swallow him. First his boots and the horse's legs disappeared. Then their bodies became a fading, ghostly silhouette. For a few seconds, he was just a dark shape moving through a formless gray void. And then, he was gone. Hester stood at the window, her hand pressed against the cool glass. The only evidence that he had been there at all was the soft, rhythmic sound of the horse's hooves on the damp ground, a sound that grew fainter and fainter until it, too, was absorbed by the profound, misty silence. He was gone. He had ridden out into the dawn to face her monster. He was going to settle a debt that was not his. He had promised her that Dawson wouldn't be back, and now he was making good on that promise. The fear was still there, a cold, familiar knot in her stomach. The world was a dangerous place, and Dawson was a desperate, unpredictable man. But as she stood there, watching the spot where Jed had vanished, a new feeling began to push up through the cold soil of her fear. It was small, but it was warm, and it was alive. It was the feeling of a tiny, resilient seed beginning to sprout in a land that had been barren for a very long time. It was trust. It was the terrifying, breathtaking, and revolutionary act of placing a small piece of her broken life into the strong, silent hands of another. The edge of the fog began to glow with the first, pale, hesitant light of the new day. The mist was a living thing, a cold, damp shroud that clung to the land, muffling sound and blurring the line between earth and sky. Jedediah Kelter rode through it, a solitary, resolute figure moving through a world not yet fully born. His big sorrel horse, Caesar, moved at a steady, mile-eating gait, its hooves making soft, rhythmic thuds on the damp ground. Jed was not a man in a hurry. Haste was the enemy of purpose. He moved with the slow, inexorable force of a river, his course set, his destination inevitable. He rode with a profound and chilling calm. There was no hot-blooded anger in him, no desire for simple brawling. What he felt was a cold, clear, and absolute sense of purpose. An equation had been presented to him, a woman with a bleeding arm and fear in her eyes. A man consumed by a weak and vicious rage, and it had created an imbalance in his world. He was now riding to correct it. The code he lived by was simple. Etched into him by the harsh, unforgiving land, he commanded, "You protect what is yours. You mend what is broken, and you do not tolerate wolves among the sheep." Last night, he had seen a wolf in his own pasture. As the sun began its slow ascent, the mist burned away, revealing the familiar, sprawling emptiness of the plains. He arrived at the edge of Harmony Creek as the town was just beginning to stir. Smoke curled from the chimneys of the bakery and the blacksmith's forge. A few early risers were on the street, their faces still etched with sleep. Jed ignored them, his gray eyes scanning the collection of false-fronted buildings. He knew a man like Dawson Pike, After a night of humiliation and impotent rage, he wouldn't be at the main hotel or the respectable saloon. He would seek out the shadows, a place that mirrored the dark, shabby state of his own soul. Jed guided Caesar down a muddy side alley, his gaze settling on a dilapidated two-story building at the far end. It was a boarding house of the lowest sort, its porch sagging and its windows grimy. A faded sign above the door read, "The Traveler's Rest," a name that was a cruel joke. This was not a place of rest. It was a place of endings. And there, slumped in a rickety chair on the porch, was Dawson Pike. He was a pathetic sight in the clear morning light. The bravado of the previous night had evaporated, leaving behind a gray, hollowed-out shell of a man. He was nursing a bottle of whiskey. His clothes were the same rumpled mess, and his face was pale and pasty, except for the dark, unshaven stubble on his jaw. He looked up as Jed's immense shadow fell over him, and a flicker of fear, quickly masked by a surly defiance, crossed his face. Jed did not dismount. He sat atop his horse, a towering figure of judgment, his hands resting calmly on the saddle horn. The position was one of effortless dominance. He looked down at Dawson, his face as hard and unreadable as a cliff face. "Get off my property, Pike," Jed said. His voice was not loud, but it was low and resonant, and it carried the indisputable weight of command. Dawson scrambled to his feet, his chair scraping loudly on the wooden porch. The bottle slipped from his grasp and rolled into the dust. "This ain't your property," he snarled, trying to muster some of his old bluster. "And you can't tell me what to do." "Anything that happens on my land is my concern," Jed replied, his voice still unnervingly calm. "And any man who works for me is my concern." He paused, letting the words settle in the quiet morning air. Then he delivered the final, damning judgment. "A man doesn't get to call a house his own when he spends his time breaking what's inside it. You forfeited that right." The simple, moral truth of the statement was like a slap in the face. It stripped away all of Dawson's pathetic excuses and justifications, leaving him exposed and raw. For a man whose entire identity was built on a fragile foundation of masculine pride, it was an unbearable insult, with a choked cry that was part rage and part desperation. Dawson launched himself off the porch, his fist drawn back for a wild, telegraphed punch. It was the desperate, clumsy attack of a cornered animal. To an observer, it might have looked fast, but to Jed, it seemed to be happening in slow motion. He moved with a speed that was shocking in a man so large. He didn't block the punch or dodge it. As Dawson's fist flew toward his face, Jed's hand shot out and simply caught it in midair. The impact was a dull, fleshy thud. Dawson's knuckles were swallowed by Jed's massive, calloused hand. There was a moment of shocked stillness. Dawson's eyes went wide, a look of disbelief on his face as he found his arm held fast, his attack rendered completely useless. Jed didn't hit back. Retaliation would have been an act of passion, and this was an act of justice. With Dawson's fist still enveloped in his own, Jed twisted his wrist, using Dawson's own momentum and weight against him. A sharp cry of pain escaped Dawson's lips as his arm was forced into an unnatural angle. Jed flowed off his horse in one smooth, powerful motion, driving Dawson down to his knees in the dusty street. He did not slam him to the ground. He forced him down with a steady, irresistible pressure, a demonstration of strength so absolute it was humiliating. He pinned Dawson to the ground with one hand pressed between his shoulder blades, his knee firmly in his back. Dawson struggled for a moment, his curses muffled in the dirt. But it was like a jackrabbit struggling against a mountain lion. The fight was over before it had even truly begun. Jed's actions were clean, efficient, and utterly devoid of hatred. It was the dispassionate and necessary act of subduing a dangerous animal. From his saddle, Jed pulled a short length of rope, a pigging string used for tying the legs of calves. With a few deft movements, he secured Dawson's hands tightly behind his back. Then He hauled the defeated man to his feet. What happened next was a deliberate spectacle. Jed, holding the end of the rope, began to lead the trust and dirt-stained Dawson Pike down the center of Harmony Creek's main street. The town was fully awake now, and people stopped in their tracks to stare. Mr. Thompson came to the doorway of his mercantile, his mouth agape. The blacksmith, a burly man named Gus, lowered his hammer, his eyes wide with astonishment. Women paused with their shopping baskets, whispering behind their hands. They saw the town pariah, the drunken gambler Dawson Pike, being led like a common criminal. But more shocking was the man leading him. Jedediah Coulter was a man who kept to himself, a quiet giant who handled his own affairs on his own land. To see him here, making such a public display, was an unprecedented event. It was a statement. Jed marched Dawson directly to the small clapboard building that served as the sheriff's office and jail. He kicked the door open and shoved Dawson inside, causing him to stumble and fall in a heap on the floor. Marshal Brody, a weary-looking man with a drooping mustache and tired eyes, looked up from his paperwork, his expression shifting from annoyance to pure shock. "Coulter, what in God's name is this?" Jed stood in the doorway, filling it completely. "Morning, Marshal," he said calmly. "Found some trouble that belongs to you." He nudged Dawson with the toe of his boot. "Dawson Pike has debts all over this territory. One of them is to Silas Blackwood, and I hear Blackwood is a man who collects—" "That's reason enough to hold him." He paused, and his voice dropped, losing its businesslike tone and taking on a hard, dangerous edge. "But his more important debt is to his wife. Last night, he paid her with his fists. That debt is mine to collect, but I'll let you handle the paperwork." The marshal looked from the formidable rancher to the pathetic man on his floor and understood. This wasn't about gambling debts. This was something far more fundamental. "He's a danger to a person under my protection," Jed finished, his meaning perfectly clear. "You'll hold him. You'll see he gets on the next stagecoach east and never sets foot in this county again. Am I understood?" It was not a request. It was an order, delivered by a man who held more true power in the county than any elected official. Marshal Brody simply nodded, his weary eyes showing a newfound respect. "Understood." Jed. The news, as news does in a small town, traveled on the wind. It reached Dusk Creek Ranch by mid-morning, carried by a young cowboy named Billy, who had been sent to town for a new buckle and had gotten an eyeful of the whole affair. He told the story with wide-eyed excitement in the bunkhouse, and the tale quickly made its way to the yard, where Hester, who was hanging laundry in the morning sun, overheard it. She stopped, a wet sheet held halfway to the line, the clothespins forgotten in her hand. She listened as Billy recounted the tale Jed's quiet arrival, the one-sided fight, the walk of shame down the main street, the finality of him leaving Dawson at the jail. Her first reaction was a familiar, reflexive jolt of fear. Dawson, the law, jail, it was a vocabulary of trouble she knew all too well. She braced herself for the fallout, for the shame, for the whispers. But as the story sank in, the fear was washed away by a powerful, rising tide of an emotion so new and overwhelming she couldn't immediately put a name to it. She stood motionless in the bright Texas sunlight, the wet sheet dripping onto the dusty ground, her mind reeling. All her life, she had been invisible. Her pain had been a private shame, a secret to be hidden under long sleeves and a placid expression. What happened behind the closed door of a marriage was a woman's burden to bear, a cross to carry in silence. But Jed Coulter had refused to honor that cruel, unspoken rule. He had taken her secret, her shame, and he had dragged it out into the public square. Not to humiliate her, but to give it a name. He had declared, for all the world to see, that what had been done to her was not a private matter, but a public crime. It was not her shame. It was Dawson's. The image of Jed marching her husband down that street, for everyone to see, was the most profoundly chivalrous act she had ever known. It was not the chivalry of poems and songs, of knights and fair maidens. It was a rugged, dusty, and unflinching Western justice. He hadn't just saved her from a beating. He had saved her from her invisibility. He had stood in the light of day and declared that she was a woman worth defending. A single tear traced a path through the dust on her cheek. It was not a tear of sadness or fear. It was a tear of sheer, shattering disbelief. She was not alone. For the first time since she was a hopeful girl of 19, she was not alone. Someone had stood for her. The world, which had seemed for so long to be a dark and terrifying place, suddenly felt a little bit brighter. For 2 days, Harmony Creek talked of nothing else. The incident involving Jedediah Coulter and Dawson Pike was a stone dropped into the still, dusty pond of their collective life, and the ripples spread everywhere. It was dissected in the saloon, debated over the anvil at the smithy, and whispered over flour sacks at the mercantile. The town, which had for so long chosen not to see, was now forced to watch, and in watching, it was forced to have an opinion. In the smoky, masculine confines of the saloon, the talk was louder, laced with whiskey and bravado, a few of the rougher sorts. Men who believed a wife was a man's property no different from his horse or his dog. Grumbled that Coulter had overstepped. Ain't his business what goes on in a man's own home? A disgruntled mule skinner muttered into his beer. But his was a minority opinion. Most of the men, hardscrabble ranchers and cowboys who lived by a simpler, harsher code, saw it differently. They saw Dawson Pike not as a husband defending his rights, but as a coward who preyed on the weak. They saw Jed Coulter's actions not as interference, but as the necessary culling of a rabid dog from the pack. Gus, the blacksmith, a man whose arms were as thick as fence posts and whose opinion carried weight, put it simply as he hammered a glowing horseshoe into shape. A man who beats his wife is no man at all, he'd grunted, and the sparks that flew from his hammer seemed to punctuate the statement with fiery agreement. The women's talk was quieter, more complex, in the mercantile. The same women who had once spoken of Hester with a grim, pitying satisfaction now spoke in hushed, altered tones. The narrative had shifted. Hester was no longer just the pitiful wife of a no-good gambler. She was the woman for whom the most powerful man in the county had laid down a law. The story of Jed Coulter marching Dawson down the main street had already taken on the quality of a legend. He didn't even raise his voice. "I heard," Eleanor said, her eyes wide. "Just took him by the collar and handed him to the marshal like a sack of bad potatoes." Even the perpetually sour Mrs. Thompson seemed to have been affected as she measured out a length of calico. Her thin lips were pressed into a line that was less disapproving and more thoughtfully grim. "Jedediah Coulter doesn't suffer fools," she stated, and in her voice there was a grudging, undeniable note of respect. They were all reevaluating. They were looking at the space Hester occupied in the world and finding that its dimensions had fundamentally changed. A week passed. A strange, quiet peace settled over Dust Creek Ranch. The ruined cookhouse had been set to rights. The broken door rehung. The shattered crockery swept away. Hester, at Jed's quiet insistence, had remained in the guest room in the main house. It was a strange, liminal existence. She was no longer just the cook, but she did not know what else she was. She found herself holding her breath, waiting for the other shoe to drop. The day came when she ran out of coffee, and she knew she could not put it off any longer. She had to go to town. The thought sent a familiar wave of cold dread through her. Before, she had feared the town's whispers about her husband. Now, she feared they would be whispering about her. She would be a spectacle, a curiosity. She braced herself for the stares, the pointing fingers, the mortifying public exposure of her private pain. Billy drove her in the buckboard, his youthful chatter a stark contrast to the silent, frantic beating of her own heart. As they drew near to Harmony Creek, she pulled her bonnet lower, trying to shrink, to make herself invisible once more. She stepped down from the wagon and walked towards the mercantile, her legs stiff, her whole body a single, taut nerve. She pushed open the door, and the little bell above it announced her arrival with a cheerful, incongruous jingle. Just as she had feared, the store fell silent. Every head turned in her direction. Mrs. Thompson, Eleanor, Martha, a half-dozen other faces, all fixed upon her. This was it. This was the moment of her public shaming. She clutched her shopping basket to her chest like a shield and prepared for the onslaught. But it didn't come. The stares were not what she had expected. They were not mocking. They were not filled with pity, that condescending emotion that had always made her feel so small. This was something entirely different. It was a direct, open, and frankly awestruck curiosity. They were looking at her as if for the first time. She was no longer a peripheral character in someone else's drama. She was the drama. She was the woman who had survived Dawson Pike. She was the woman Jed Coulter had defended. In their eyes, she had been transformed from a victim into a survivor. And there was a subtle but profound difference in the way they looked at a survivor. She walked stiffly to the counter, her gaze fixed on the floorboards, but she could feel the weight of their eyes on her. She felt rather than saw. Eleanor turned to Martha and gave a slow, deliberate nod. It was a small gesture, but it was immense. It was a signal of acknowledgement, of a shared understanding. It was the silent communication of women who knew the hardships of this life, who knew how easily a woman could be broken, and who were now looking at one of their own who had refused to break. Hester placed her list on the counter. Her voice, when she spoke, was a reedy whisper. "Morning, Mrs. Thompson. I need coffee, please, and some flour." "Mrs. Thompson looked at her, her sour expression softening for a fraction of a second into something almost gentle. "Of course, Hester," she said, in the use of her first name, spoken with a simple, unadorned respect, was so unexpected it almost brought tears to Hester's eyes. Jed had been gone for most of the week, seeing to business on a distant corner of his vast property. He returned late one afternoon, riding in on Caesar, looking tired, dusty, and as solid as the earth itself. Hester's heart gave a strange, unfamiliar leap at the sight of him. She was in the cookhouse, preparing the evening meal. When he came in, the room was clean and orderly again, filled with the warm, comforting smells of baking bread. He came in quietly, as was his way, and took a tin mug from the hook. The comfortable routine of it was both reassuring and deeply unsettling. The old, simple dynamic of employer and employee had been irrevocably shattered. Now, the space between them was charged with 1,000 unspoken things. She took the coffee pot from the stove and filled his mug, her hand trembling slightly as she held it out to him. Their fingers brushed as he took it, and a jolt, warm and startling, shot up her arm. She pulled her hand back as if burned, her face flushing. He took a sip of the coffee, his gray eyes looking at her over the rim of the mug. He seemed to be studying her, taking in the way she stood, the way she held herself. There was a new quietness about her. Yes, but the deep, ingrained tension around her eyes had lessened. She was no longer a creature perpetually braced for a blow. He set the mug down on the table and looked at her, his gaze direct and serious. She thought he might ask her about Dawson, or about what had happened. She thought he might tell her what was to become of her, what he expected. Instead, he said something so simple, so unexpected, that it completely unmoored her. "You've got choices now, Hester." The words hung in the quiet, sun-drenched air of the kitchen. Choices. The word was so foreign, so utterly alien to her experience, that for a moment it had no meaning. Her life had been a narrow, well-worn path of duties and obligations, a series of rooms she had been locked into, first by her father, then by her husband. She had never been the one to hold the key. Her life was something that happened to her, a current that carried her along without her consent. She stared at him, her brow furrowed in confusion. What do you mean?" "I mean," he said, his voice patient and low, That Dawson's gone. He won't be coming back. The cabin is empty. This job is yours for as long as you want it. But you don't have to stay. There's a stage that leaves Harmony Creek every week. It can take you east, back to your family if you have them. It can take you west, to California, if you want a new start. The world is bigger than this ranch." He paused, his eyes holding hers. "The choice is yours. What you do next is up to you." And then, with a small nod, he picked up his hat, turned, and left, leaving her alone with the most terrifying and liberating sentence she had ever heard. She sank onto a nearby stool, her legs suddenly too weak to hold her. "You've got choices now. It was a key." He had just handed her the key to her own life. It was a gift so immense, so profound. She didn't know what to do with it. For years, she had dreamed of escape. But it had always been a vague, desperate fantasy. She had never considered the practical reality of it, because she had never believed it was possible. Choices. It meant she could leave this place, this land of dust and painful memories. She could go somewhere no one knew her name, where she wasn't Dawson Pike's wife or Jed Kelter's cook. She could be just Hester. The thought was so radical it made her dizzy. But it also meant she could stay. She could stay here, in this kitchen that felt more like a home than any place she had ever known. She could stay on this ranch, under the vast, open sky, and under the quiet, protective gaze of the man who had given her back to herself. He wasn't telling her what to do. He wasn't demanding gratitude. He wasn't trying to possess her, as Dawson had. He was doing the opposite. He was setting her free. He had faced down her tormentor, not to claim her as a prize, but to give her the one thing Dawson had stolen, her own will. Hester looked down at her own two hands, resting on the worn wooden table. They were chapped and strong, hands that knew how to work, how to create, how to endure. For the first time, she saw them not just as instruments of labor, but as instruments of choice. They could knead dough, or they could pack a bag. They could stir a pot, or they could wave goodbye. They were hers, her hands, her life. The realization was a quiet, shattering dawn in the long, dark night of her soul. The word choices echoed in the silent spaces of Hester's days. It was a seed Jed had planted, and she tended to it with a fearful, hesitant curiosity. For the first time, she began to look at the world not as a cage, but as a map of branching paths. The idea of leaving was a whisper of a possibility, a terrifying freedom she would roll over in her mind in the quiet of the night. But the idea of staying was a quiet, steady pull, a gravitational force centered not just on the safety of the ranch, but on the man who had shown her what safety felt like. The change in the weather came on with a biblical swiftness. The morning had been ordinary, the sky a vast, placid bowl of washed-out blue. But by noon, the world had gone still. A strange, expectant hush fell over the land. The birds stopped singing. The usual drone of insects ceased. The air grew thick, heavy, and hot, and the light took on a sickly, yellowish-green tint, as if the world were being viewed through a piece of dirty glass. The horizon to the west, once a clean, sharp line, was now a bruised, churning wall of black and brown, a roiling mass of cloud and dust that was swallowing the sky. The ranch hands knew the signs. Voices were low, movements hurried. Horses were brought into the barn, tools were secured, and the heavy wooden shutters on the main house and the bunkhouse were latched. It was a familiar drill, the practiced choreography of people who understood the violent temper of the land. Hester stood in the doorway of the cookhouse, watching the approaching storm. It was a living thing, a monstrous, malevolent entity that was breathing down on them. A low, continuous rumble, more a vibration in the bones than a sound, grew steadily in intensity. The first tendrils of wind whipped through the yard, tasting of grit and ozone, kicking up small dust devils that danced and died. Then, above the rising moan of the wind, she heard a new sound. It was a sharp, frantic banging, a metallic shriek that cut through the air. Clang, scrape, bang! Clang, scrape, bang! She looked up. On the roof of the cookhouse, A large sheet of corrugated tin roofing, loosened by years of sun and wind, had been caught by a gust. It was flapping violently, held on by only a few remaining nails, threatening to tear loose at any moment and become a deadly, spinning blade in the storm. Her kitchen, her sanctuary, the place she had defended from one kind of storm, was now threatened by another. An old instinct, the one that told her to hunker down, to hide, to wait for the danger to pass, rose up in her. But it was immediately met by a new, stronger impulse. The woman who had told Dawson Pike, "I'm not yours to break," was not the same woman who would let her home be torn apart by a storm. She didn't think, she acted. Her eyes scanned the side of the building, and she remembered seeing an old, rickety ladder lying in the tall grass behind the woodshed. She ran, the wind tearing at her skirts, her hair whipping loose from its pins. She found the ladder and, with a grunt of effort, dragged it to the side of the cookhouse, propping it against the wall. It was a dangerous, desperate idea, but the thought of inaction was more terrifying. From the small tool shed, she grabbed a hammer and a handful of long nails, stuffing them into the deep pocket of her apron. She saw a coil of thick rope and, on impulse, slung it over her shoulder. She started up the ladder, her knuckles white where she gripped the worn, splintery rungs. The wind was a physical force now, pushing against her, trying to peel her from her perch. Dust, fine as flour, stung her eyes and filled her mouth, tasting of the dry, angry earth. Jed saw her from the barn, where he was helping the last of the hands secure the heavy doors. He saw the small, determined figure in a calico dress, halfway up a rickety ladder, with a hurricane of dust and fury bearing down on her. A cold bolt of fear shot through him, followed by a wave of something else, a fierce, profound admiration. He didn't shout for her to get down. He knew, with an absolute certainty, that it would be useless. The woman on that ladder was not a person who would be ordered to safety. He moved with the swift, silent purpose she had seen in him before. He grabbed a heavier hammer and a leather pouch of roofing nails from the workshop. "Hank, get that door!" he yelled over the roar of the wind. And then he was sprinting across the yard, his head down against the stinging onslaught of sand and debris. Hester had just reached the edge of the roof when Jed got to the bottom of the ladder. He put a hand on it to steady it, his presence a solid, reassuring anchor in the chaos. She scrambled onto the roof, her hands and knees scraping against the rough tin. The wind up here was a howling, living monster. It threatened to lift her up and throw her back to the ground. She had to lie flat, her body pressed against the shallow pitch of the roof, to keep from being swept away. The loose sheet of tin was bucking and shrieking like a creature in its death throes. She crawled towards it, the rope slung across her back, the hammer a heavy, solid weight in her apron pocket. It was a battle for every inch. A moment later, Jed was on the roof with her. He moved with a low, leonine grace, his larger body more stable in the wind. He didn't speak. He couldn't. The wind would have torn the words from his mouth. Instead, he simply crawled to her side, his presence a silent statement. "You are not alone in this." What followed was a ballet of desperation and unspoken understanding. They were no longer a rancher and his cook. They were two people fighting a common enemy. He pointed to the flapping corner of the tin sheet, and she nodded, her grit-caked face set with determination. He held the sheet down with his immense weight, his muscles straining as the wind tried to rip it from his grasp. Hester, lying beside him, took out her hammer and a nail. Her first swing was clumsy, the wind catching the hammer and nearly wrenching it from her hand. But the second swing was true. The sharp, clean sound of the nail biting into the wooden beam below was a small victory against the roar of the storm. They worked as a team, their movements synchronized by necessity. He would pin a section, she would drive a nail. The world shrank to the small, violent space on that rooftop. There was only the howling wind, the stinging sand, the shuddering roof beneath them, and the task at hand. Their shoulders brushed, their arms crossed, their bodies working in a close, desperate proximity born of the storm's fury. She could feel the heat and strength of him beside her. A solid wall against the chaos. He could feel the surprising, wiry strength in her, the absolute, unyielding focus of her will. It was a conversation more profound than any they had ever had. A dialogue of shared effort and mutual trust, conducted with hammers and nails in the heart of a hurricane. Finally, the last nail was driven home. The violent, frantic banging ceased. The sheet of tin was secure, pinned to the roof. Its protest silenced. They had won. They lay there for a moment, side by side, chests heaving, their faces caked with a muddy mixture of sweat and dust. The worst of the storm was passing over them now. The wind, while still strong, had lost its shrieking, malevolent edge, and the thick, blinding curtain of dust was beginning to thin. Slowly, as if by some unspoken signal, they both pushed themselves into a sitting position. They were exhausted, battered, and filthy. They looked at each other. Hester's hair was a wild, tangled mess, and a small cut on her cheek was bleeding slightly. But her eyes, clear and steady, were blazing with a light Jed had never seen before. As they sat there on the peak of the roof, the last of the storm clouds blew past, and the sun broke through. The light, clean and golden, washed over the land, illuminating a world that had been scrubbed clean. The air was fresh and cool, and a profound, ringing silence had replaced the storm's deafening roar. The sky was a brilliant, impossible blue, wiped clean of every last trace of dust and turmoil. They looked out at the transformed world, and then they looked back at each other. Jed reached out, his calloused thumb gently wiping away the trickle of blood and grime from her cheek. His touch was as light as a whisper. He looked into her eyes, and he saw not a trace of the fear that had haunted them for so long. He saw strength. He saw resilience. He saw the woman who had climbed a ladder into the teeth of a storm to save her own home. His voice, when he spoke, was low and rough with emotion, but it was perfectly clear in the new, clean silence. No one breaks you again. It was not a promise this time. It was a statement of fact, an observation, an acknowledgement of the truth he saw before him. Hester held his gaze, and for the first time in his presence, for the first time in a decade, a true, genuine smile touched her lips. It was a small, weary thing, but it transformed her face, lighting it from within. She didn't need to speak. She simply nodded. It was an agreement, a treaty signed in the quiet aftermath of a storm, on the roof of a small house that they had saved together. The story of Dawson Pike did not end with a bang, but with a dusty, ignominious whisper. A few days after Jed Coulter had delivered him to the marshal, word filtered back to the ranch. Silas Blackwood had come to collect his debt, finding Dawson in jail with not a dollar to his name. Blackwood had paid his fine on the condition that Dawson sign over the deed to their failed homestead, a worthless patch of rock and dust that was, nonetheless, the last thing on earth he owned. The next morning, Marshal Brody had personally escorted a hollow-eyed, defeated Dawson to the eastbound stage. He had climbed aboard without a word, a ghost leaving a town that had already forgotten him. His only legacy, a string of bad debts and a reputation as the man who had been publicly shamed by Jedediah Coulter. He simply vanished, an unpleasant stain scrubbed from the fabric of the county. When Hester heard the news, she felt not a flicker of triumph, nor a shred of pity. She felt nothing at all. It was as if a long, painful chapter in a book had finally been closed, and she was free to turn the page. Her first act of freedom was to walk to the small, sad cabin at the edge of the property. She had not set foot in it since that night. The door hung ajar, a silent invitation. The air inside was stale, smelling of old whiskey and despair. It was a tomb filled with the ghosts of a dead dream, with a grim, quiet determination. She set about exorcising them. She threw open the single window, letting the clean, sun-drenched air pour in. She stripped the soiled linens from the bed, took down the grimy curtains, and began to scrub. She scrubbed the floors with lye soap until the wood was pale and raw. She scrubbed the walls as if she could physically remove the memory of his angry voice. She packed his few remaining belongings, a worn-out shirt, a tarnished razor, a deck of greasy playing cards into a burlap sack. She did not burn it. That would have been an act of passion, and he was no longer worth her passion. She simply left the sack by the side of the track for the next scavenger to find. The only things she kept were a small, dog-eared book of poetry her mother had given her and a chipped porcelain teacup. They were hers. They had existed before him. The work was hard and cleansing. By the time the sun set, the cabin was transformed. It was no longer a prison. It was just an empty room, a blank slate, scrubbed clean of its past. She closed the door, and for the first time, she turned the key in the lock, leaving the ghosts inside. The next morning, she turned her attention to the small, neglected patch of earth behind the cookhouse. It had once been a vegetable garden, but it had long since been overrun with weeds and baked into a hard, cracked shell by the sun. Armed with a spade and a hoe, she began the painstaking work of reclamation. Her hands, already calloused from the kitchen, grew tougher. She dug into the stubborn soil, her back aching, her brow beaded with sweat. She pulled up the thorny weeds, roots and all, and cast them aside. She broke up the hard, sun-baked clods of earth, turning them over and over until the soil was dark, rich, and yielding. The work was slow, methodical, and deeply satisfying. With every weed she pulled, she felt as if she were pulling a strand of bitterness from her own soul. With every patch of earth she cultivated, she was tilling the fallow ground of her own future. Jed watched her from a distance. He would see her out there in the early mornings and the late afternoons. A small, solitary figure bent over the earth, her movements rhythmic and purposeful. He saw that she was not just gardening, she was healing. She was putting down roots. She made a trip to town, and this time, she walked into the mercantile with her head held high. She bought packets of seeds beans, squash, carrots, and on a whim, she bought a small, fragrant starter plant of mint. She took her purchases back to the ranch and planted them with the care of a mother tending to a newborn. She watered the soil, her fingers trailing in the cool, dark mud. Life, she was discovering, was a stubborn, persistent thing. Give it a little space, a little care, and it would grow. The days settled into a new rhythm, one defined not by fear, but by a quiet, steady purpose. The seasons began to turn. The brutal, oppressive heat of summer softened, and the mornings grew crisp and cool. The light took on a gentler, more golden quality. Hester's world was the cookhouse and her garden. She polished her copper pots until they shone like mirrors. She scrubbed the long wooden tables until they gleamed. Her kitchen became a place of immaculate order and comforting warmth, a true sanctuary that was wholly and completely hers. The mint she had planted began to spread, its bright green leaves releasing a clean, sharp fragrance every time she brushed against them. Jed still came to the cookhouse every morning. It was a ritual that had become the quiet, unspoken center of their new reality. He would enter as the sun was rising, and she would have a mug of hot, black coffee waiting for him. The tense, watchful silence that had once defined their interactions had been replaced by a comfortable, easy quiet. They did not need many words. "Morning, Hester," he would say, his deep voice a familiar comfort. "Mr. Calter," she would reply, a small, genuine smile touching her lips. Sometimes, he would stand at the door, sipping his coffee and looking out at her garden. "Looks like the beans are coming in strong," he might observe. "They are," she would say, "the squash, too." It was a simple exchange, but it was filled with a world of meaning. He was noticing. He was seeing the new life she was building for herself, and he was acknowledging it with his quiet, steady approval. He never spoke of Dawson. He never spoke of that night. It was as if he understood that her healing depended on looking forward, not back. He had given her choices, and he was now silently, steadfastly, giving her the space to make them. One morning, she woke even earlier than usual. A sliver of a moon still hung in a sky that was just beginning to soften from black to a deep, velvety indigo. The air was cool and still, and the world was bathed in a pale, ethereal light. She felt a profound sense of peace, a feeling of rightness that settled deep in her bones. She lit a lamp in the kitchen, put the coffee on to boil, and then stood at the open doorway, simply watching the day be born. She thought of the woman who had arrived at this ranch months ago, a creature of fear and habit, hiding her bruises and her pain behind a mask of placid endurance. She thought of the journey she had taken, from that silent, terrified woman to the one who had climbed a roof in a storm, who had dug her hands into the earth and coaxed life from it. She thought of the words that had been her turning point, the simple, powerful truth she had discovered in the heart of the chaos. She was not aware that she had spoken aloud. The words were a soft, barely audible whisper, a breath of sound in the quiet dawn, spoken not for anyone else, but for herself. A final, definitive affirmation. "I'm not yours to break." A soft footfall on the porch behind her made her start. Jed was standing there, his hat in his hand, his coffee mug still on its hook. He had come earlier than usual, and he had heard her. She turned to face him, a blush rising on her cheeks, feeling as though he had overheard a secret, private prayer. He didn't speak. He simply looked at her, and in his calm, gray eyes, she saw an ocean of understanding. He had not just heard the words. He had understood their entire journey. He walked past her into the kitchen and poured himself a mug of coffee. He came back and stood beside her in the doorway, the two of them watching as the eastern sky began to bleed with the first pale gold of the sunrise. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. Instead, he reached out and gently, simply, placed his hand over hers where it rested on the doorframe. It was not a gesture of possession or passion. It was a gesture of quiet solidarity, of profound and simple connection. His hand was large, warm, and calloused, a map of a hard-working life. It covered hers completely, a shield of strength and tenderness. It was a silent promise, not of ownership, but of partnership. It said, simply, "I am here." Hester looked at their hands, his covering hers, and then she looked out at the horizon. A brilliant, golden light began to pour over the land, chasing away the last of the shadows, making the dew on her mint leaves sparkle like diamonds. The air was still. Dust Creek Ranch was quiet, and in the warm, gentle space between their two hands, a new and boundless freedom was beginning. Thank you so much for listening to our story. We'd love to know where in the world you're tuning in from, so please leave a comment below to say hello and share your thoughts. If you enjoyed this tale, please subscribe to our channel, Wild West Stories 1850, and give this video a like. To help this story reach more listeners, please also consider hitting the hype button to show your support. We appreciate every one of you.